September 1967. Las Vegas, Nevada. The Sands Hotel showroom was packed with high rollers and celebrities who had paid premium prices to witness Joey Bishop's late-night comedy set, a performance that would become infamous in entertainment circles for decades to come. The comedian stood under the spotlight, microphone in hand, working through his usual repertoire of self-deprecating humor and gentle jabs at his famous friends in the Rat Pack. The audience laughed on cue, drinks flowed freely, and the desert night seemed like any other in the gambling capital of America. No one anticipated that within the next 5 minutes, Joey Bishop would make the worst mistake of his professional career. The joke started innocently enough, as most disasters do when comedians venture into dangerous territory without fully considering the consequences of their words. Joey was riffing about Hollywood marriages, a topic that always generated laughs from audiences who consumed celebrity gossip like oxygen and delighted in the failures of those more famous than themselves. He mentioned Elizabeth Taylor's multiple divorces, made a crack about Mickey Rooney's matrimonial adventures, and then, fatally, turned his attention to Frank Sinatra's romantic history with a carelessness that would haunt him for years. What Joey Bishop said about Ava Gardner that night was heard by approximately 400 people in the Sands showroom, but the version that reached Frank Sinatra's ears within the hour was amplified by repetition and the natural tendency of gossip to become more damaging with each retelling. The joke touched on Ava's reputation, her tempestuous relationship with Frank, and included an implication about her personal life that crossed every line of decency that existed between friends, even friends who regularly roasted each other in public for entertainment purposes. Ava Gardner was not just any ex-wife to Frank Sinatra. She was the love of his life, the woman who had nearly destroyed him when she left, the ghost that haunted every relationship he would ever have after their divorce in 1957. Their marriage had lasted only 6 years, but their connection transcended legal paperwork and continued long after the divorce was finalized. Frank still called her regularly, still sent her money when she needed it, still defended her honor against anyone foolish enough to speak ill of her in his presence. The audience in the Sands showroom that night included several individuals who recognized immediately that Joey had made a catastrophic error in judgment that would require damage control of the highest order. Among them was a casino executive with direct connections to Sinatra's inner circle, a man who understood that what he had just witnessed needed to be reported before Frank heard about it from less sympathetic sources who might exaggerate the offense even further than it already warranted. Frank Sinatra was in Los Angeles that night, at his home in the Trousdale Estates neighborhood, where he often retreated when not performing or filming. He was watching television when the phone rang at approximately 11:45 Pacific Time, interrupting a quiet evening that was about to become anything but peaceful. The caller was the casino executive from the Sands, speaking in the hushed tones of someone delivering news they knew would provoke an explosive response from the recipient. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, during which Frank Sinatra said almost nothing while absorbing the information about what Joey Bishop had said about Ava Gardner in front of 400 witnesses and however many additional people those witnesses would tell before the precise night was over. When the call ended, Sinatra sat in silence for several minutes, his face displaying an expression that his household staff had learned to recognize as the precursor to volcanic rage that could destroy careers and relationships with equal efficiency. What happened next would become one of the most talked about incidents in the history of the Rat Pack, a story whispered in Hollywood circles for decades as evidence of Frank Sinatra's legendary temper and his equally legendary loyalty to the women he had loved, even those he was no longer married to. The phone call that Joey Bishop received, approximately 30 minutes after Frank learned about the joke, would change their relationship permanently and serve as a warning to everyone in the entertainment industry about the consequences of crossing certain lines. Joey Bishop was still in his dressing room at the Sands, removing his stage makeup and basking in what he believed had been a successful performance, when his phone rang with a call that his assistant said was from Frank Sinatra and could not wait until morning under any circumstances. Joey picked up the receiver with the casual confidence of a man who had spoken to his friend hundreds of times over the years of their professional collaboration and personal friendship. That confidence evaporated within seconds of hearing Frank's voice. The conversation between Frank Sinatra and Joey Bishop that night lasted approximately 12 minutes. According to later accounts from people who were present in Joey's dressing room and could hear Frank's voice clearly through the receiver, despite not being on the line themselves, what they heard was not the voice of a friend calling to discuss business or share gossip about mutual acquaintances. It was the voice of a man who had been personally wounded and who intended to make the responsible party understand exactly how serious that wound was. Frank did not yell during the call, which those who knew him understood was far more dangerous than any explosive outburst could have been. His voice was low, controlled, and carried a menace that made Joey Bishop's hands shake visibly as he held the phone and listened without interrupting. The words Frank used were precise, surgical, designed to convey maximum damage to Joey's sense of security about his position in the entertainment world and his future relationship with the most powerful man in show business. The threat was clear, without being explicit enough to constitute anything legally actionable. A skill Frank had developed through decades of navigating worlds where power was exercised through implication rather than direct statement. Joey understood that his career at the Sands was over, that any project involving Sinatra's participation or approval was now closed to him, and that he had approximately 24 hours to make a public apology that might, if Frank deemed it sufficient, allow him to continue working in Las Vegas at all. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened between Frank Sinatra and Joey Bishop in September 1967 involves one of the most feared phone calls in Hollywood history, a joke about the woman Sinatra loved more than any other, and consequences that would reshape the dynamics of the Rat Pack forever. By the end of this story, you will understand why even Frank's closest friends learned to never mention Ava Gardner's name without extreme caution. Joseph Abraham Gottlieb was born on the 3rd of February 1918 in the Bronx, New York, to Jewish immigrant parents who had fled Eastern Europe seeking better opportunities in America. His childhood was marked by the poverty that affected millions during the Depression years, a formative experience that would drive his ambition to succeed in show business and escape the economic uncertainty that had defined his early life. He changed his name to Joey Bishop as a young man, adopting a stage persona that would carry him from small clubs to the biggest stages in America. Unlike the other members of the Rat Pack, Joey Bishop had built his career primarily through television and nightclub work, rather than music or film. His comedy style was intellectual, understated, and relied on timing rather than physical humor or shock value to generate laughs from audiences who appreciated sophistication over vulgarity. This approach had earned him respect in the industry, but also created a perception that he was somehow less talented than his more flamboyant colleagues in Sinatra's inner circle. Joey's relationship with Frank Sinatra had begun in the late 1950 seconds, when the Rat Pack was still forming around the nucleus of Sinatra's magnetic personality and professional connections. Frank appreciated Joey's sharp mind and his ability to serve as the group's unofficial writer, crafting jokes and bits that the others would deliver on stage during their legendary performances at the Sands and other venues across Las Vegas and beyond. The dynamic within the Rat Pack was complex, with clear hierarchies that everyone understood but rarely discussed openly. Frank was the undisputed leader, the sun around which everyone else orbited. Dean Martin was his closest equal, a true friend whose relationship with Sinatra transcended professional collaboration. Sammy Davis Jr. brought extraordinary talent, but navigated the group as a black man in an era of segregation. Peter Lawford provided political connections through his marriage to Patricia Kennedy. And Joey Bishop was the intellectual, the writer, the comedian who made everyone else look funnier. Joey had always understood his place in this hierarchy and had accepted it without complaint, because the benefits of association with Sinatra far outweighed any ego bruises that came from being clearly subordinate to more charismatic personalities. He had access to the best venues, the best opportunities, and the protection that came with being part of Frank's inner circle, in an industry where such protection could mean the difference between success and obscurity. But September 1967 had been a difficult month for Joey Bishop, whose new television talk show was struggling in the ratings and facing cancellation threats from ABC executives who had expected better returns on their investment. The pressure had affected his judgment, making him reach for edgier material during his nightclub performances in search of bigger laughs that might translate into the kind of buzz that could save his struggling television career. The joke about Ava Gardner had emerged from this desperation, a calculated risk that seemed worth taking in the moment when the audience was responding enthusiastically to his Hollywood marriage material. Joey had made similar jokes about other celebrities without consequence, and in his stressed and exhausted state, he had failed to recognize that Ava Gardner occupied a completely different category in Frank Sinatra's universe than any other woman he might have mentioned. Ava Lavinia Gardner had been born on the 24th of December 1922 in Grabtown, North Carolina, a tiny community so poor that it made Joey Bishop's Bronx childhood look privileged by comparison. She was the youngest of 7 children in a family of sharecroppers who struggled to survive during the worst years of the Depression. Her beauty was evident from childhood, a genetic gift that would eventually carry her from tobacco fields to Hollywood stardom and into the arms of some of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry. She arrived in Hollywood in 1941, a 17-year-old with a thick Southern accent and no acting training, but a face that cinematographers described as the most photogenic they had ever encountered. MGM signed her to a contract and spent years grooming her for stardom while she appeared in small roles that showcased her beauty without requiring significant dramatic ability. The transformation from country girl to movie star was gradual but inexorable. Ava's first marriage to Mickey Rooney in 1942 lasted barely a year, a union between a teenage beauty and a diminutive movie star whose serial infidelities quickly destroyed whatever affection had initially brought them together. Her second marriage to bandleader Artie Shaw in 1945 was equally brief, ending after Shaw's intellectual pretensions and emotional abuse convinced Ava that she deserved better than men who saw her only as a trophy to be displayed and discarded. Frank Sinatra entered Ava's life in 1949, when both were at complicated points in their respective careers and personal lives. Frank was still married to his first wife, Nancy, the mother of his 3 children, but his obsession with Ava quickly overwhelmed any sense of obligation to his existing family. Their affair was passionate, destructive, and impossible for either of them to end, despite the damage it caused to everyone around them. The divorce from Nancy Sinatra was finalized in 1951, and Frank married Ava almost immediately in a ceremony that felt more like a continuation of their torrid affair than the beginning of a stable marriage. The following years were marked by legendary fights, equally legendary reconciliations, and a mutual destruction that fascinated the public while devastating both participants in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Ava's affairs during the marriage, whether real or rumored, drove Frank to jealous rages that sometimes resulted in physical confrontations and always resulted in emotional devastation that affected his work and his health. He attempted suicide at least once during their marriage, unable to cope with the prospect of losing the woman he loved more than his own life to other men who seemed to offer her something he could not provide. The divorce in 1957 ended the marriage, but not the connection between Frank and Ava, which continued through phone calls, financial support, and an understanding that transcended the legal dissolution of their union. Frank never stopped loving Ava, and those who knew him well understood that any criticism of her was effectively criticism of him, an attack on his judgment, his taste, and his heart that he would never forgive, regardless of the source. By 1967, Ava Gardner was living primarily in Spain, having largely retired from Hollywood to escape the pressures of an industry that had chewed her up and spit her out after extracting maximum value from her beauty and limited but genuine talent. She was 44 years old, still beautiful, but no longer the goddess who had captivated audiences in the 1,950 seconds, and she depended increasingly on Frank's financial generosity to maintain a lifestyle that her own earnings could no longer support. Frank's protectiveness of Ava had only increased as her circumstances declined, as if he felt responsible for the trajectory that had taken her from movie stardom to semi-retirement in a foreign country, far from the Hollywood that had once worshipped her. Anyone who insulted Ava was effectively insulting Frank's judgment in loving her, his failure to keep her happy during their marriage, and his ongoing commitment to her well-being that many of his subsequent wives and girlfriends resented. Joey Bishop knew all of this history, had witnessed Frank's continued devotion to Ava over the years of their friendship, and should have known better than to make her the subject of a joke designed to generate cheap laughs from an audience that would forget the performance by the next morning. His failure to apply this knowledge in the moment of his desperate reach for edgier material was a lapse in judgment that he would regret for the rest of his career. The night after the phone call, Joey Bishop did exactly what Frank Sinatra had demanded. He issued a public apology during his next performance at the Sands, explaining that his previous night's material had included comments that were inappropriate and hurtful to people he respected. He did not mention Ava Gardner by name, but everyone who had been present the night before understood exactly what he was apologizing for and why. The apology was accepted by Frank, in the sense that Joey was not immediately banned from Las Vegas or blacklisted from the entertainment industry, as Sinatra had the power to do. But the relationship between the two men was fundamentally altered in ways that would never fully heal, a distance that grew gradually over the following years, until Joey Bishop was effectively outside the inner circle that had defined his career for nearly a decade. Dean Martin, who learned about the incident from multiple sources before either Joey or Frank discussed it with him directly, maintained his characteristic neutrality while privately expressing surprise that Joey had been foolish enough to touch the one subject that everyone in their circle knew was absolutely forbidden. Dean had made his own jokes about Frank over the years, but he had never, ever mentioned Ava Gardner in anything other than respectful terms. Sammy Davis Jr., whose own relationship with Frank had survived challenges that would have destroyed lesser friendships, understood exactly how dangerous Joey's mistake had been. Sammy had witnessed Frank's reaction to perceived slights against Ava multiple times over the years, and had learned to steer conversations away from her entirely when Frank was present or likely to hear about what was said. The Rat Pack continued to perform together occasionally in the years following the incident, but the chemistry that had made their shows legendary was noticeably diminished by the tension between Frank and Joey that audiences could sense even without knowing its specific cause. Joey's role in the group became increasingly marginal, his contributions reduced, his presence at private gatherings no longer as welcomed as it had once been. Joey Bishop's television talk show was canceled by ABC in 1969, ending a troubled run that had never achieved the ratings or cultural impact that the network had hoped for when they gave the relatively unknown comedian a platform to compete with Johnny Carson. Some industry observers speculated that Sinatra's influence had contributed to the show's difficulties, though no direct evidence of such interference was ever documented publicly. The 1,970 seconds brought further distance between Joey and the remnants of the Rat Pack, with Frank focusing on his own career resurgence and Dean retreating into his successful television variety show while dealing with personal tragedies that would eventually break his spirit. Sammy continued to work constantly, driven by an energy that seemed inexhaustible until illness finally slowed him down in the late 1,980 seconds. Peter Lawford had already been expelled from Frank's circle by 1967, his connections to the Kennedy family having become a liability after the assassination of JFK and the subsequent estrangement between Sinatra and the political dynasty he had once supported enthusiastically. Peter's decline was steeper than Joey's, his career and health deteriorating rapidly, until his death in 1984 from complications related to his addictions. Joey Bishop survived longer than most of his Rat Pack colleagues, living until October 2007, when he died at the age of 89 in Newport Beach, California. In interviews during his later years, he rarely discussed the incident with Ava Gardner, deflecting questions with the professional skill of a comedian who had learned that some topics were better left unexplored, even decades after the relevant parties had died. Frank Sinatra maintained his connection with Ava Gardner until her death on the 25th of January 1990, from pneumonia in London. He paid for her medical care during her final illness, sent her money regularly throughout the years, and mourned her passing with a grief that surprised those who thought he had moved on through his subsequent marriage to Barbara Marx. The love of his life was gone, and no one who had ever joked about her was fully forgiven. Ava Gardner was buried at Sunset Memorial Park in Smithfield, North Carolina, near the small town where she had been born 67 years earlier. Frank did not attend the funeral, reportedly too devastated to face the finality of her burial, but he sent flowers and a private message to her family that expressed feelings he had never been able to articulate publicly during her lifetime. Barbara Sinatra, Frank's fourth wife, understood that she would never fully possess her husband's heart as long as the memory of Ava Gardner occupied the space that no living woman could fill. She accepted this reality as the price of being married to Frank Sinatra, a man whose capacity for love was as legendary as his capacity for rage, and whose devotion to his past could sometimes overshadow his commitment to his present. The story of Joey Bishop's joke and Frank's terrifying phone call became part of the mythology that surrounded the Rat Pack, a cautionary tale about the boundaries that existed even among friends who seemed to share everything, including their public personas and their private jokes. Some boundaries were absolute, and Ava Gardner represented the most absolute boundary in Frank Sinatra's universe. Entertainment historians who study the Rat Pack era often cite the 1967 incident as a turning point in the group's dynamics, the moment when the illusion of equality among the members was shattered by a reminder of who held real power and what happened to those who forgot their place in the hierarchy. Joey Bishop's career survived, but his relationship with the man who had made that career possible never recovered. The Sands Hotel, where the fateful performance took place, was demolished in 1996 to make way for the Venetian Resort, erasing the physical location of so many legendary Rat Pack performances and the night when Joey Bishop learned that some jokes were not worth telling, regardless of how big the laugh might be. Frank Sinatra died on the 14th of May 1998, 8 years after Ava Gardner and 20 years after the height of his final career resurgence. His funeral was attended by celebrities, politicians, and ordinary fans who had loved his music for decades. But the woman he had loved most was not there to say goodbye because she had preceded him into whatever awaited beyond this life. Joey Bishop did not attend Sinatra's funeral, his absence noted by those who remembered the closeness they had once shared and the distance that had grown between them in the decades since that night at the Sands, when a desperate comedian had reached for a joke that would cost him more than any laugh was worth. The legacy of Frank Sinatra includes not only his music and his films but also the fierce loyalty he showed to those he loved and the equally fierce retribution he delivered to those who violated the trust he extended to his inner circle. Joey Bishop experienced both sides of this personality, enjoying the benefits of Sinatra's friendship for years before discovering the consequences of betraying it through a moment of thoughtless cruelty. Ava Gardner's memory lives on through the films she made during her Hollywood career and through the stories told about the legendary romance she shared with the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. Their love story was tragic, destructive, and ultimately immortal in ways that neither of them could have predicted when they first met in the late 1940s. The phone call that Joey Bishop received that night in September 1967 was described by witnesses as the most frightening conversation they had ever overheard, a masterclass in controlled rage delivered by a man who had perfected the art of intimidation through decades of navigating worlds where power was expressed through whispers rather than shouts. Frank never explicitly detailed what he said to Joey during those 12 minutes, but the effect on the comedian was visible for days afterward. Joey performed his shows, delivered his apology, and continued his career. But something had changed in his eyes that those who knew him recognized as the look of a man who had glimpsed the abyss and barely escaped falling into it. The entertainment industry of the 1960 seconds was built on relationships and hierarchies that determined who worked, who succeeded, and who disappeared into obscurity regardless of their talent or ambition. Frank Sinatra sat at the apex of this system, a position he had earned through talent but maintained through a combination of charm and menace that kept everyone around him aware of the boundaries they could not cross. Joey Bishop crossed one of those boundaries and paid a price that, while not as severe as it might have been, fundamentally altered his trajectory in the industry and his place in the social circle that had defined his professional identity for nearly a decade. The lesson was clear to everyone who witnessed the aftermath. The women in Frank Sinatra's life occupied a protected category that even his closest male friends approached with caution and respect. His mother Dolly, his daughters Nancy and Tina, his wives past and present, and above all Ava Gardner, were subjects that required careful handling by anyone who valued their relationship with the most powerful man in entertainment. This protectiveness was not about control or possession, but about love expressed in the only way Frank Sinatra knew how to express it, through fierce defense of those he cared about against a world that he perceived as constantly threatening the people and things he valued most. Joey Bishop had inadvertently attacked something sacred. The years following the incident saw Joey Bishop fade gradually from the spotlight that had once illuminated his career so brightly during the golden years of the Rat Pack. He continued working, appearing on television shows and in nightclub performances, but never again achieved the level of success and recognition that his association with Sinatra had once provided. The comedy clubs of Las Vegas remembered Joey Bishop as a regular performer throughout the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds. A familiar face who drew modest crowds of older patrons who remembered his glory days with the Rat Pack and wanted to recapture some of that magic through his solo performances. The edge that had once defined his comedy had softened with age and caution. Dean Martin occasionally invited Joey to appear on his television specials, maintaining a professional relationship that never fully recovered the warmth of their earlier friendship. These appearances were cordial but distant, two men who had shared stages and dressing rooms for years, now navigating around memories neither wanted to discuss openly. The death of Dean Martin on Christmas Day 1995 hit Joey harder than he expected. A reminder of how much time had passed since the Rat Pack had dominated Las Vegas and how few of the original members remained to remember what those days had really been like behind the glamour and the headlines. Sammy Davis Jr. had died 5 years earlier, in 1990, the same year as Ava Gardner, leaving Joey and Frank as the last surviving members of the core Rat Pack, besides the already ostracized Peter Lawford. The group that had seemed invincible in its prime was being slowly erased by mortality. Joey Bishop gave occasional interviews about the Rat Pack years as he aged, carefully curating his memories to emphasize the camaraderie while avoiding any discussion of the conflicts and hierarchies that had defined the group's internal dynamics. He never publicly discussed the incident involving Ava Gardner. When pressed by interviewers about his relationship with Frank Sinatra, Joey would deflect with the practiced skill of a veteran comedian, offering anecdotes that revealed nothing while appearing to share intimate details. The real stories remained locked behind a discretion born of experience. Frank Sinatra's later years were marked by health issues that gradually diminished the voice and energy that had made him legendary. His final concert tour in the early 1990 seconds showed a man struggling against age, but refusing to surrender the stage that had been his home for more than 5 decades. Barbara Sinatra cared for Frank during his decline, managing his affairs and protecting him from a world that still demanded access to the man who had defined an era of American entertainment. She understood better than anyone the ghosts that haunted him, including the ghost of Ava Gardner. The entertainment industry that the Rat Pack had dominated transformed beyond recognition in the decades following their peak. Las Vegas became a family destination, the mob influence faded, and a new generation of performers emerged who knew Frank Sinatra only through recordings and films. But the stories persisted, passed down through entertainment circles, like oral traditions, preserving the memory of a time when certain men wielded power that could make or break careers with a single phone call placed in the middle of the night to a dressing room in Las Vegas. Joey Bishop's final years were spent in relative obscurity in Southern California, surrounded by memories of a career that had reached heights few comedians ever achieve and depths that served as warnings to those who followed. He had survived, which was more than some could say. The legacy of the Rat Pack continues to fascinate new generations who discover their music, their films, and the mythology that surrounds their legendary performances at venues that no longer exist in a Las Vegas that barely remembers their names except as marketing opportunities. Frank Sinatra's influence on American popular culture remains immeasurable. From his vocal innovations, to his film performances, to the persona he created that blended vulnerability with danger in ways that no performer before or since has quite replicated successfully. The phone call that Joey Bishop received that September night in 1967 was never recorded, its contents known only through the accounts of those who witnessed its aftermath and the permanent change it created in a friendship that had seemed unshakable until the moment it wasn't. Some lessons can only be learned through painful experience, and Joey Bishop learned his lesson about the boundaries that existed even among friends who seemed to share everything. Ava Gardner's name was never again spoken carelessly by anyone who valued their relationship with Frank Sinatra. The Sands Hotel showroom, where Joey Bishop made his fateful joke, has been replaced by modern attractions that bear no memory of the nights when the Rat Pack held court and the most powerful men in entertainment decided careers with. Whispered conversations and phone calls that terrified their recipients into compliance with unwritten rules that everyone understood but no one dared to challenge openly. The morning after the phone call, Joey Bishop sat alone in his suite at the Sands, staring at the telephone that had delivered Frank Sinatra's fury just hours before. His hand still trembled slightly as he poured coffee that he could barely taste, his mind replaying every word of the 12-minute conversation that had fundamentally altered his understanding of his place in the entertainment hierarchy he had navigated so carefully for nearly a decade. His wife Sylvia arrived from Los Angeles that afternoon, having heard about the incident through industry contacts who had already begun spreading the story with the enthusiasm that Hollywood reserved for the downfall of those who had once seemed untouchable. She found her husband uncharacteristically quiet, his usual quick wit replaced by a contemplative silence that worried her more than any outburst could have. The apology Joey delivered that night was crafted with the precision of a man who understood that his future depended on saying exactly the right words, in exactly the right tone to satisfy an audience that now included not just the paying customers but the invisible presence of Frank Sinatra, monitoring his compliance with the demands delivered during that terrifying phone call. Casino executives at the Sands watched Joey's performance with particular attention, aware that their own positions could be affected by how well the comedian managed the delicate task of public contrition without explicitly admitting what he had done wrong. The entertainment industry was built on such careful negotiations between public image and private reality. Word of the incident spread through Las Vegas within days, carried by cocktail waitresses, casino dealers, and entertainment executives who understood the currency of such information in a town built on secrets and the strategic deployment of knowledge about the powerful. Everyone who worked the Strip knew by week's end that Joey Bishop had crossed Frank Sinatra and survived. Barely. The other members of the Rat Pack received the news through their own channels and processed it according to their individual relationships with both Joey and Frank. Dean Martin, characteristically, said little but made mental notes about boundaries he would never cross, regardless of how much bourbon clouded his judgment during performances. Sammy Davis Jr. understood the implications more deeply than most, having navigated his own complicated relationship with Frank through years of careful deference balanced against the need to maintain his dignity as an artist and a man in an era when such dignity was constantly under assault from multiple directions. Peter Lawford, already exiled from Frank's inner circle, heard about the incident with the bitter satisfaction of someone who recognized that he was not the only one capable of falling from Sinatra's grace. His own descent had been steeper and more permanent, but Joey's stumble provided a reminder that no one was truly safe. The entertainment press covered the story obliquely, as they did most matters involving Frank Sinatra's personal life and relationships. Columnists who depended on access to celebrities knew better than to report directly on incidents that might anger the most powerful man in their industry. So they spoke in coded language that insiders understood perfectly. Ava Gardner learned about the incident weeks later through a phone call from Frank himself, who wanted her to hear his version before gossip reached her through other channels. She reportedly laughed when told what Joey had said, then grew serious when she understood how Frank had responded to defend her honor against a man who had been his friend. The relationship between Frank and Ava remained complicated even as he defended her against others. They argued frequently during their phone calls, their passion undiminished by distance or the years since their divorce. She could wound him more deeply than any comedian's joke, yet he protected her reputation with a ferocity that surprised even those who knew him well. Barbara Marx, who would become Frank's fourth wife in 1976, was already part of his social circle in 1967 and witnessed the aftermath of the Joey Bishop incident from a distance. She learned early the lesson that would define her eventual marriage. Ava Gardner occupied a space in Frank's heart that no living woman could ever claim. The Sands Hotel management navigated the situation with the diplomatic skill required when two valuable assets came into conflict. Joey Bishop was a reliable draw who filled rooms on nights when bigger names weren't available, but Frank Sinatra was the foundation upon which much of their entertainment reputation had been built over the years. Ultimately, business considerations prevailed over personal loyalty, as they usually did in Las Vegas, where the bottom line trumped all other values. Joey was allowed to continue performing at the Sands, but his billing was reduced, his schedule became less favorable, and the implicit message was clear to anyone paying attention to such details. The comedy community observed the incident as a cautionary tale about the risks of improvisation when powerful people were involved in the subject matter. Younger comedians learned that certain topics required careful consideration before being incorporated into any routine, regardless of how big the potential laugh might be. Frank Sinatra's reputation for protecting the women in his life was reinforced by the Joey Bishop incident, adding another layer to the mythology that surrounded him. He was simultaneously the romantic crooner who sang of love and loss, and the dangerous man who destroyed those who threatened what he held dear. The 12-minute phone call became legendary in entertainment circles. Its contents debated and embellished with each retelling, until the actual words spoken were probably lost beneath layers of speculation and dramatic enhancement. What remained consistent was the terror that Joey Bishop had experienced and the permanent change in his relationship with the man who had made his career possible. Joey never publicly discussed the specific content of Frank's threats, maintaining a discretion that served him well in an industry where silence about certain matters was rewarded and loose talk was punished severely. He took the secrets of that phone call to his grave in 2007. The autumn of 1967 continued with Joey Bishop performing his reduced schedule at the Sands, while his ABC talk show struggled toward its eventual cancellation. The two failures seemed connected to observers who believed that Frank Sinatra's displeasure had ripple effects throughout the entertainment industry that extended far beyond Las Vegas. The legacy of that September night endures in the oral traditions of Hollywood, A story passed from generation to generation of entertainers who understand that certain boundaries exist even among friends who seem to share everything, including their public personas and their private vulnerabilities. Frank Sinatra drew those boundaries around the people he loved, and Ava Gardner stood at the center of the most protected space in his universe, untouchable by anyone who valued their career or their peace of mind. Rest in peace, Frank Sinatra. The voice that serenaded millions also knew how to whisper threats that chilled the blood of those who had crossed the lines you drew around the people you loved. Joey Bishop learned that lesson in a 12-minute phone call that changed everything between you and Ava Gardner. The woman you never stopped loving remained protected by your devotion even after she was no longer yours to protect. Some loves transcend marriage, divorce, and death itself, and yours for her was one of those rare eternal flames that burned until your final breath and beyond.